Today, we're going to discuss 5 ways inflation affects your money. Let's talk about it. Hey, I'm Kyle. I talk about money, and if you're new to this channel, hit that subscribe button and share this video. If you had $1 million sitting in your bank account doing nothing, by this time next year, you would have lost about $25,000 of value due to inflation. At a historical rate of 2.5% a year, your money is losing its value if you're simply holding onto it in the form of cash. Sadly, most people don't talk about inflation as a big part of their financial situation. I want to start by going into detail a little bit about how inflation happens. This will hopefully give you an idea of how our money works. So, how does inflation happen? Inflation is caused by a central bank when they inject cash into the system, print money. Every time they do this, it dilutes the value of the cash already in existence. Central banks print money in order to encourage economic growth. The money printed is available as a loan to commercial banks at the prevailing interest rate. The Federal Reserve's interest rate, U.S. Central Bank, as of this video, is about 2.25%. That means the Fed loans out the money to banks with an interest of 2.25%. With that infusion of cash, the banks can then lend out that money at a higher rate to you and me to pay for houses, cars, boats, and funding for businesses. A commercial bank makes money by borrowing money from the central bank at whatever interest rate they set. They then lend out that money to you and me at a higher rate. The difference between their loan to you and what they borrow is their profit. Let's say they borrow from the Fed at a rate of 3%. They then will lend it to you at maybe 7%. That's a 4% profit for the bank. That's a simple summary of how the economy works. It's a very similar situation with most countries in the world. So how does this all relate to you? Well, inflation is connected to interest rates set by the central banks. If interest rates are low, banks are able to borrow more and loan out more since paying back the money is relatively cheap. More loans means inflation goes up since there's more money in the economy. On the flip side, when interest rates are high, people and banks are less willing to borrow and less money is introduced in the economy. The Fed has a targeted range of about 2% inflation a year, and for the most part, it's kept that going for almost 100 years. So to summarize inflation and interest rates, low inflation rates equals higher inflation, and high interest rates equal low inflation. Inflation isn't always so bad. There's another correlation with interest rates and inflation. Inflation on the surface sounds bad since I began this video on how we lose about 2.5% of the value of our money every year. But it's not a bad thing. So when interest rates are low, that means people and businesses borrow more since it's considered cheap money. People then use that money to buy a house or buy a brand new TV or maybe get a new car. Perhaps they use that extra money to go on vacation. Companies can buy more equipment and hire more workers to ramp up productivity. Economic activity occurs because people are willing to spend for goods and services. That's how a thriving economy works. On the same side of that coin, because of the cheap money, investors can borrow money to buy stocks. When more money is going to the stock market than coming out, the stock market rises. This also contributes to a thriving economy. More money available means more spending for goods and services. Since the Great Recession, in order to jumpstart the economy, the central banks of the world lower the interest rates to near zero. That means banks can borrow some really cheap money and then loan it out at record low rates. People took advantage of the low borrowing rates, and over time that has stirred investments and spending. So inflation isn't all that bad. On the other side of that coin, when the central banks raise interest rates, that means less spending and less investments. This in turn means the stock market goes down since the rate of return in the stock market isn't as attractive as they used to be. So does your salary keep up with inflation? Now that you have a good idea of inflation as it pertains to the economy, it should be noted that inflation does have a dark side. If you're a salaried employee, most likely your salary isn't keeping up with inflation. That means your $75,000 a year salary is worth $73,125 next year. This isn't great because the price of goods usually increases by about 2.5% a year to adjust for inflation. Many call this the consumer price index, where they account for the rise in in goods of services year over year. Want to know how bad it is? In the 1990s, I remember a hamburger at McDonald's being only 27 cents. It's a little over $1 today. That's a problem if you're stuck with the same salary year after year. Inflation is eroding your purchasing power. Let's say in the year 2000, your salary was $75,000 a year. If you kept that exact same salary until today, your inflation adjusted salary would be $51,000. To keep up with inflation, your salary should increase by about 2.5% a year. If you're worried about minimum wage, the federal government and states usually increase it to account for inflation. Even Social Security increases every year to account for an increase in the cost of living. But since millions of people are salaried workers, you should find out if your salary adjusts for inflation every year. It's bad to hold on to cash. Noting at the beginning of this video, you shouldn't ever have your money just sitting somewhere collecting dust. It constantly needs to work to keep up with inflation. I get it if you need cash reserves just in case of an emergency, or maybe sideline funds just in case you want to buy assets when they go down. But just leaving your money in your bank account is not the way to do things. Remember, inflation is eating up that purchasing power of your money. The only assets that tracks inflation are government bonds. In the US, this is specifically talking about the 10-year US Treasury bonds. As of this video, it's about 3%, which is about what the inflation rate is. You can purchase these bonds and they essentially pay you the rate, in this case 3%, every year for 10 years. US Treasury bonds are considered practically guaranteed, so you're just about certain to receive 3% every year you own the bond. Now, you can sell the bond if you need the cash and make a purchase. This will preserve the value of your money so that it's not wasting away. I'm oversimplifying things, but you get the idea of how bonds work. You're taxed on inflation. Here's another bad thing about inflation that even less people ever realize. It's that you'll be taxed higher just because the numbers are inflated. Look at the bonds example. You buy bonds at 3% return per year. However, you're taxed on that 3% gain. Now, there are some taxable and non-taxable bonds, but for this example, we're going with taxable bonds. Since bonds usually pay you 4 times a year, you're receiving that extra income. It's going to get taxed. Let's say you buy $1 million worth of bonds. It increases 3%, $30,000. Check your tax bracket because you're going to get taxed on that amount. That means you're getting taxed on inflation, and it gets worse. Let's say your salary doesn't increase year to year. You're stuck at $75,000 a year until you get promoted or find a higher paying job. This year it's $75,000, but next year the value goes down 2.5% due to inflation, $73,000. It's still going to say you make a salary of $75,000, and yes, you're still going to pay tax on $75,000 even though your purchasing power has been reduced. How crazy is that? Next year, that $75,000 salary is again eaten up by inflation, and it's now at $71,000. You'll again be paying taxes on $75,000. It's important you speak with your employer and go over inflation on how it affects your salary. Many employers do adjust salaries based on an increase in cost of living, partially due to inflation, but make sure. Inflation is a very confusing topic to grasp, but it's important to know so you can approach your personal finances with the right knowledge. I outlined some good, some bad, and some tips on how you should tackle inflation. Use it to seek higher returns on your investments, but know that it's something that can wither down your purchasing power if you're not informed of its effects. Inflation is simply a reality of life for almost every country in the world. 2 things I want you to take away from this video. 1, ask your employer if your salary can be adjusted for inflation. Cost of living, increase, if that's not already the case. Number 2, using low interest rates to your advantage by borrowing cheap in order to invest. So that's something to think about. If you want to take care of your money, hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you stay up to date on when new videos come out. Don't forget to check out my other videos on personal finance, business, and investing. Until next time, I'm Kyle, and thanks for watching.